Chapter 1. The Harvest Fair and the Smock. It was the sort of golden September morning that made even the most cantankerous souls in the village of Clunbury feel mildly optimistic. The Harvest Fair had returned after a 3-year absence. Its cancellation during the past seasons blamed variously on funding, committee infighting, and one unfortunate outbreak of food poisoning tied to Mrs. Weatherby's ill-fated chutney stall. But today, the bunting flapped cheerfully, the brass band warmed up near the church steps, and the smell of cider and cinnamon drifted across the green. There were pie contests, pickling displays, and a modest petting zoo that included 3 bored goats and an indignant-looking goose-dot Miss Jane Marple. Visiting her old friend, Miss Clarissa Hartwood, had been persuaded to attend by virtue of nostalgia. "You always did adore a good village fair," Clarissa said that morning, fluffing her hat in the mirror. "All those people pretending they don't judge each other, and yet judging so deliciously." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple had replied, buttoning her coat with quiet efficiency. "Village fairs are perfect for observing human nature. Everyone's too busy watching everyone else to notice they're being watched." By 11:30, the fair was at its most bustling. Children darted between hay bales. Farmers exchanged gruff hellos over gleaming pumpkins. And near the old blacksmith's shed, a local artist named Josiah Crane stood demonstrating his craft for a small audience. Josiah was not what one might call beloved. A quiet, ink-stained bachelor in his late 40s, he'd spent years turning out rustic sketches of livestock and village landmarks, always wearing the same pale brown smock streaked with paint and turpentine. People tolerated him with a mixture of local pride and mild condescension. His work had once been highly commended by a minor regional paper, which had given him an air of modest importance that no one felt like challenging. That morning, he had set up a makeshift booth easel, folding stool, and a wire rack of framed drawings. He was mid-sketch of the Vicar's Labrador when the first scream rang out. It came from behind the butter churn competition, where young Lily Pratt had tripped over something large and soft near the edge of the allotment plot. 2 minutes later, a cluster of horrified onlookers had gathered. By the time Constable Brent arrived, breathless and pink-faced, the scene was clear. Josiah Crane was dead. He lay crumpled in the grass beside a barrel of decorative squash, his arms outflung, one boot missing, his face eerily calm. The smock was still buttoned, the edges stained with mud. His sketchbook lay nearby, pages fluttering in the breeze. The constable crouched, stared for a long moment, then said, "Get Dr. Featherly, quick as you like." Word spread as it always did, like warm jam on fresh bread. "Dropped dead right there," said Mrs. Larch at the jam tent, dabbing her brow. "Heart, surely, or heat stroke." "It was a very strong tea," added Reverend Maitland, who had shared. "A cup with Josiah just an hour before." "Or poison," muttered Lily's older brother under his breath. "I heard he was in debt to the wrong sort." Miss Marple said nothing. She was kneeling beside Clarissa at the back of the crowd, her eyes not on the body, but on the smock. Specifically, the left side pocket, which sagged oddly. Most assumed it was art supplies or some crumpled paper. Miss Marple's gaze lingered for a long time. By early afternoon, the body had been moved to the local surgery. Dr. Featherly, who could never resist sounding important, announced to a cluster of eager ears that the cause of death appears. Sudden, possibly internal, but that the constable will be coordinating with the coroner's office in Little Bramley. The harvest fair, now shadowed by tragedy, sputtered onward. Prizes were awarded, the band played a few solemn hymns, and Clarissa's gooseberry pie received second place on account of its overconfidence. Miss Marple remained quiet for most of the afternoon. She helped Clarissa pack away a tray of shortbreads and smiled politely at the vicar's remarks. But her thoughts kept returning to Josiah's smock and to a single glimpse she had caught before the constable lifted it away, a torn scrap of dark red fabric barely visible inside the pocket. Not a handkerchief, not paint-stained cloth dotted. Looked like velvet, and Josiah Crane had never owned anything of the sort. That evening, as the shadows lengthened and the fair's bunting was taken down by teenage volunteers with little enthusiasm, Miss Marple sipped her tea in Clarissa's sitting room and asked one simple question. Did Josiah Crane have any close friends? Clarissa snorted softly. None, unless you count his cat, and even she preferred the neighbors. Enemies? Then? Oh, no more than anyone else. He once accused the baker of stealing his sketch of the village square. He said it appeared on a tea towel without permission, caused a minor stir. Did he ever travel? Only once, Clarissa said thoughtfully. He spent a week in London last spring. Came back looking older, quieter. Odd, now that I think of it. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. There had been no signs of struggle, no indication of trauma, yet something about the smock and that velvet nagged at her. Artists, she knew, observed everything, but they also collected memories, impressions, grievances, and, perhaps, secrets. The sort of secrets that could rest quietly in the pocket of a man's coat until one day they killed him. Chapter 2. Whispers After the Fair. By Monday morning, the remnants of the harvest fair had all but vanished. Only a few crushed paper cups and scattered hay hinted at the weekend's festivities. The bunting had been packed away, the prize vegetables returned to their owners, and the decorative scarecrow, who had presided cheerfully over the allotment plot, now leaned sideways in the wind. Forgotten dot, but in Clenbury, no death passed quietly, especially not one as peculiar as Josiah Crane's dot at the village post office. Miss Nora Simpkins reported that the artist had been deathly pale, all weak gray as flour. I said so to Mr. Jeffries. At the butcher's, Mr. Hargreaves insisted that Josiah had seemed perfectly normal until he asked for smoked ham on credit. That's never a good sign. And at the small general shop, young Lily Pratt, who had found the body, was being gently consoled with sweets she had not. Paid for, Clarissa. Hartwood was already growing tired of the speculation by the time Miss Marple returned from a quiet walk to the vicarage. It's all turning into theater, Clarissa sighed over breakfast. Mrs. Tiller swears she saw a red mark on Josiah's neck, like a thumbprint, she said. Nonsense. I was standing 2 feet away and saw nothing of the sort. Miss Marple buttered her toast without looking up. People often see what they need to believe. Clarissa gave her a shrewd look. You're thinking something, Jane. I can see it in your knitting. Miss Marple, who had not touched her needles all morning, allowed a small smile. Just observing. The fair revealed more than it meant to, and Josiah Crane, for all his quietness, seems to have left behind a great deal of noise. By noon, Miss Marple had made her way to the village surgery. Dr. Featherly was not fond of unsolicited questions, but he had a soft spot for elderly. Ladies who spoke in proverbs and brought him shortbread. I can't officially comment. He began, peering over his glasses, until the coroner sends a formal report. But yes, the death was sudden. No obvious trauma. Heart failure is the likely cause. Of course, Miss Marple said gently. But not poison? Featherly looked scandalized. Miss Marple, this is Clunbury. Not a penny dreadful. And yet she replied mildly, I once knew a woman in Nether Down who died at her own birthday tea after a cordial of elderflower. The flower was genuine. The gin beneath it laced with digitalis. The doctor coughed and adjusted his spectacles. Well, as I said, I'm not ruling anything out. She stood, brushing imaginary crumbs from her sleeve. Of course not, Doctor. That would be most unwise. As she turned to go, she paused. Tell me, was anything taken from Josiah's pockets before you examined him? Not by me, Featherly said. Brent checked for identification, but everything was kept together. Keys, a pencil stub, 2 shillings, a folded sketch, and 1 glove, all turned over to the constable. A glove? Yes, only one, oddly. A child's glove, too small for him by half. Miss Marple blinked. And no mention of cloth? Velvet. Perhaps? Featherly frowned. No. Though I suppose something may have been missed. His smock was rather a mess. Miss Marple's next stop was the station. Constable Brent Young, sincere, and frequently flustered, was scribbling at his desk when she entered. Miss Marple, he said, standing up at once. We, haven't had the post-mortem yet, but I'm not here to pressure you. Constable, she said gently, I've come to ask if I might see Mr. Crane's possessions only briefly. The contents of his pockets, Brent hesitated. That's a bit unusual. I know, she said, but so was a child's glove and a dead man's coat. He blinked. You know about the glove? I've heard it mentioned, and I suspect you have too. Brent disappeared into the adjoining room and returned with a small canvas pouch. I shouldn't, but well, if it's you. Inside the pouch were the items Dr. Featherly had listed. Coins, keys, the pencil, a dog-eared sketch folded twice, a charcoal rendering of the war memorial, and a tiny child's glove-white cotton, stained faintly with what looked like oil. Paint. Miss Marple held the glove delicately between her fingers. Left-handed, she murmured. Brent stared. How can you tell? The smudging, she said. From thumb to pinky, just so. Likely worn by someone drawing or mimicking Zomi. Who does? Do we know any children who sit for Josiah's sketches? Can't say, Brent muttered. Though that Gilda Martin's girl is always hanging about his place. Odd little thing. Bit too quiet. Miss Marple returned the glove and sketch to the pouch. Might I suggest, Constable, that you ask Miss Gilda Martin whether her daughter has recently misplaced a glove or visited Mr. Crane's studio? He jotted it down. Yes, Miss Marple. And perhaps, she added, whether Mr. Crane was involved in any unusual tutoring arrangements, artistic or otherwise. Brent looked puzzled, but nodded. That evening, Clarissa was waiting with cake and gossip. Well, she said, pouring tea with dramatic flair, Gilda Martin was seen speaking to the constable in the lane. Apparently, little Alice did visit Josiah's studio once a week for drawing. He taught her free of charge, isn't that odd? Not necessarily, Miss Marple said. Children often have a natural affinity for art, and artists for solitude. A well-mannered pupil may have suited him. Yes, Clarissa muttered, but I hear Alice told Brent she wasn't the only one. That Josiah was teaching someone else in secret. A woman. Miss Marple set down her cup. Did she say who? No, but she said the woman gave Josiah a red cloth once. A swatch for something special. Miss Marple was very still. Red velvet? Clarissa nodded. That's what Alice called it. Said it was shiny and soft and smelled faintly of perfume. Miss Marple sat back in her chair. A child's glove. A red swatch of velvet. A secret lesson. These were not the sorts of details that pointed to heart failure. They were the sorts of things left behind carefully to be noticed, and Miss Marple, quietly knitting beneath the flickering lamplight, began to notice them all. Chapter 3. The Woman in Velvet by Tuesday morning. The village had found a new word to fixate upon. Velvet had whispered its way through Clunbury's hedgerows and stone cottages, traveling from Mrs. Jeffrey's parlor to the benches outside the post office where the local ladies took their tea with a side of rumor. Red velvet so daring, so not Clunbury was now linked indelibly with the late Josiah Crane, and once a garment or fabric entered local legend, it took on a life of its own. Miss Marple, of course, kept her thoughts tightly buttoned beneath her cardigan. She had begun her morning with a walk to the high street, pausing thoughtfully before the windows of Butterfield's drapery. It was a modest shop, more practical than posh, but it carried bolts of cloth, ribbons, and the occasional bolt of indulgence. She stepped inside to the faint jingle of a brass bell. Behind the counter, Miss Audrey Butterfield, small, wiry, and always one breath away from declaring someone scandalous, looked up. Miss Marple, come to treat yourself to something lovely? Just browsing, Miss Marple said, moving to the far side of the shop. Her eyes scanned the shelves until she found what she was looking for, a square of red velvet folded neatly atop a bolt of cotton muslin. It was the exact shade she had seen peeking from Josiah's smock. She turned back to the counter. Audrey, dear, has this particular velvet been popular of late? Audrey sniffed. Popular? Good heavens, no. Too dramatic for everyday wear. I ordered that length 6 months ago on a whim. Only one person's shown interest. Oh? Mrs. Rosalind Dacre ordered 1.5 yards. Said she needed it for a costume. The church's harvest play, or some such? Miss Marple's eyes did not waver. Rosalind Dacre, the new arrival? The very one. Glamorous in that cool way, don't you think? Always wears silk blouses and never buys anything on sale. Doesn't seem the sort to involve herself with amateur dramatics, but who knows with these city women? Miss Marple smiled. And did she say what the costume was for? No, said Audrey, arching a brow. But she paid in cash, took the parcel, and left in rather a hurry. Mrs. Rosalind Dacre lived in one of the newer houses at the end of Plum Lane, red bricked, with trellised roses and a wrought iron gate. She had arrived in Clunbury just 6 months prior, having moved from London for her nerves, according to Clarissa, though Rosalind herself claimed she wanted peace and air, not prescription bottles. Miss Marple had met her twice, once at a Women's Institute meeting where Rosalind declined tea, and again in the grocer's where she purchased tinned olives and oatcakes and nothing resembling an actual meal. She was, to Miss Marple's eye, A woman with a highly polished exterior and a carefully hidden past. Rosalind answered the door in a fitted gray cardigan and linen trousers, her blonde hair swept back into a knot that defied the morning breeze. "Miss Marple," she said with a faint smile. "This is a surprise. I do hope I'm not intruding. I've been thinking of Josiah Crane." Rosalind's smile faltered for half a second. "Terrible business. You knew him? Barely?" "I saw his work once. Rather bleak. Dead-eyed sheep and such, but talented, certainly." Miss Marple tilted her head. "I understand you purchased red velvet from Miss Butterfield not long ago. Was it for the harvest play?" Rosalind's eyes narrowed, just slightly. "It was. I was asked to help with costumes. I'm afraid I never quite got around to finishing the work." "Strange," Miss Marple said lightly. "The vicar's wife tells me the harvest play was canceled in July, when the church roof began leaking." There was a pause. Then Rosalind laughed, a smooth and polished sound. "Oh dear. It must have been something else then. Perhaps a personal project. You know how one forgets things." Miss Marple smiled as though reassured. "Of course. I'm always forgetting where I put my thimbles. So many pockets." She let the sentence hang. Rosalind shifted. "Do come in for tea?" "No, thank you. I won't keep you." As Miss Marple turned to leave, she paused by the gate. "One last thing. Did you ever sit for Mr. Crane?" Rosalind blinked. "Certainly not." "Why?" "Oh, no reason. Only I found it interesting that someone left a swatch of red velvet in his coat pocket. I thought perhaps it might have been yours." Rosalind's voice was steady. "No, I have no idea what you're referring to." But her knuckles gripping. The gate had turned slightly white dot. Miss Marple returned to the village just as the sun broke through the morning clouds. She found Clarissa in the sitting room, sorting recipes and grumbling over the state of her sugar jar. "Well?" Clarissa asked, the moment she saw her friend's expression. "Rosalind Dacre lied," said Miss Marple simply. "She gave Crane the velvet, and I suspect she sat for him too, though not in any formal capacity." Clarissa dropped her spoon. "You think she posed?" "I think she confided. Perhaps she came to him for a portrait, or to preserve something of herself. Artists are not just recorders, they are confessors, especially the quiet ones. And what would she need to confess?" Miss Marple looked out the window toward Plum Lane. "That," she said softly, "is what we must discover." That evening a knock came at Clarissa's front door. It was young Constable Brent, holding a folder and looking rather solemn. "I thought you should know," he said to Miss Marple. "The coroner's initial report is in." "Yes, heart failure," he said, but frowned. "Brought on by acute stress. Possibly induced." "Induced how?" He tapped the folder. "Trace amounts of belladonna in his system. Not enough to kill outright, but more than medicinal." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And that," she said, "is not something Josiah Crane would have taken willingly. Not with a child sitting for him." Brent hesitated. "You believe someone slipped it to him?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "In tea, perhaps, or a cordial. It would not be difficult if one were invited into his studio." She looked toward the hearth where her knitting sat untouched. "Find out," she said quietly, "who visited Josiah Crane during the last week of his life, especially on Friday." Constable Brent nodded, already scribbling notes. "And one more thing," she added. "See if anyone's missing a painting A painting? Yes, said Miss Marple. Something new, something red. Chapter 4. The portrait no one claimed the following morning brought a fine drizzle that softened the air and left the cobblestones of Clonbury glistening. It was the sort of gray, whispering weather that seemed to encourage secrets rather than chase them away. The scent of damp earth clung to the hedgerows, and the village moved at a slower, more deliberate pace, as though nature itself were holding its breath dot at the corner shop, where a kettle was always on, and the gossip flowed as freely as milk. Mrs. Digby leaned across the counter and whispered to Clarissa, "They say Josiah's studio was broken into last night." Clarissa blinked. Broken into? Who would want to steal dusty sketches of chickens? Mrs. Digby lowered her voice further. Not a thing was taken, apparently, but the place was in a right state. Drawers opened, canvases shifted. Someone was looking for something. Clarissa, who had developed a finely tuned ear for anything worth repeating to Miss Marple, marched straight home and relayed the news before she even removed her gloves. Miss Marple, seated near the fire, looked up. "From her mending." "That confirms it, then," she said. "There was something in that studio worth hiding." "You really think someone risked sneaking in just to retrieve a painting?" "Not just any painting," Miss Marple murmured. "One with velvet and memory. Josiah Crane's cottage. Sat just past the lich gate, at the far end of a lane where the trees leaned overhead, and the shadows fell early. The house was plain, with ivy climbing one side and a garden that was more bramble than bloom. A small wooden sign above the door read, "Studio. By appointment only. Constable Brent. Met Miss Marple there at midday." His trousers were muddied, his expression weary. "You were right," he said. "Someone came in through the side window. No signs of forced entry, so either they had a key or knew how to work a latch." It rained just after, which washed away most prints. "And was anything taken?" he hesitated. "Not exactly, but one large canvas, was missing from the rack. The empty space is obvious. There's still a faint outline of where the frame had been." Miss Marple stepped inside the studio. The air was heavy with the smell of turpentine and old paper. Canvases leaned against every wall. Cottages, garden gates, all in Josiah's signature palette of grays and ochres. But to the trained eye, the disarray was too purposeful. Someone had turned things over to make it appear haphazard, but had left the oldest and least valuable sketches untouched. It was a false mess. A stage-set dot, Miss Marple moved toward the desk, where an open ledger rested. She scanned the entries. His clients were few, mostly villagers commissioning drawings of homes, pets, and one notable painting of the church choir done last spring. But one name stood out, R.D., entered 3 times in careful script over the past month. No details, no title, just initials. She touched the page gently. 3 sittings, Brent nodded. Must be the missing painting. "And I suspect," Miss Marple said, "that it was never meant to be seen." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a second visit to Butterfield's drapery. This time she purchased a spool of thread she did not need, a pair of thimbles for Clarissa, and in the way she had perfected over a lifetime, engaged Audrey Butterfield in conversation about hem lengths, fabric care, and velvet. "Oh, yes," Audrey said, leaning forward eagerly. "Rosalind Dacre bought the red velvet in August. But do you know, she came back just a few days ago, asked if I had any more." "Really?" said Miss Marple, feigning mild surprise. "Yes. I told her it had all gone, and she looked, well, quite thrown. Almost nervous. Said she'd dropped the original and needed to replace it for consistency. Odd word, don't you think?" "Very," Miss Marple agreed. Audrey leaned in further. "And then this is the curious bit. She asked if I sold matte varnish, not shellac or finishing oil varnish, for canvas." Miss Marple blinked. "Varnish?" "Yes. I told her we don't stock it, but it struck me as unusual. Who varnishes? Velvet?" Back at Clarissa's, Miss Marple laid out her conclusions. Rosalind Dacre sat for Josiah. More than once. She gave him the red velvet, perhaps for a background or a costume, and likely posed for a portrait she never wanted finished. Clarissa tilted her head. "But why? People sit for portraits all the time." "Yes, but they rarely steal them." "Back," Miss Marple replied. "And fewer still drug the artist who painted them." Clarissa paled. "You think she poisoned him?" "Not to kill, at least, not at first, but enough to make him ill. Perhaps to buy time, to delay. Maybe she feared he was going to exhibit the piece, or show it to someone, and she panicked." Clarissa sat back slowly. "And the break-in?" "She returned for the painting," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps she believed it held some evidence of who she truly was." "Like what?" Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Have you noticed the scar beneath Rosalind's left ear?" Clarissa blinked. "Yes, thin, pale. A surgical scar, I always thought. Perhaps, or perhaps not. Scars can mark many things. But I suspect it ties to her past, a past she believed was long buried." Clarissa leaned forward. "What do we do?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "We let her reveal herself." The opportunity came sooner than expected. That evening, Rosalind Dacre appeared at the vicarage for a Women's Institute meeting. She wore a pale green coat and a pearl brooch. Her manner as poised as ever, but as Miss Marple approached her gently and said, "I wonder, Mrs. Dacre, if I might ask your help with a small matter of portraiture." Something in her expression cracked. "Portraiture?" Rosalind asked, her voice just a shade too high. Double quotes, "Yes. I'm cataloging Josiah Crane's private commissions for the Vicar's archive. There's one missing, you see. Something he labeled R.D. We'd so hoped it might still be found." Rosalind smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm afraid I know nothing about it." "No?" Miss Marple said kindly. "That's a shame, because I'm told it featured velvet, a most distinctive shade of red." There was a long, trembling pause, and in that silence Miss Marple saw it, the faint clenching of Rosalind's jaw, the flicker of calculation behind her eyes, the weight of a secret dragged back into the light. Rosalind turned away. "I really must be going," she said. "It's getting late." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "It's rather past time." And as she watched Rosalind retreat down the path, coat fluttering like a curtain at the close of a play, she knew the portrait had existed. The velvet had mattered. And somewhere perhaps hidden behind a cupboard, perhaps already burned, was the truth about Rosalind Dacre. But Miss Marple had no intention of letting it disappear. Chapter 5. The sitter who never sat still. The next day dawned, pale and cold as if the village itself had drawn a breath and refused to exhale. There was a sense of expectation in the air, like the moment before the curtain rises on the final act of a play. The news of Rosalind Dacre's awkward exchange at the Women's Institute meeting had already made its way into the whispers of Clunbury's morning routines. At the bakery, Mrs. Larch noted that Rosalind had not appeared for her usual lemon tart. At the post office, Mr. Jeffries quietly mentioned that no outgoing post had been collected from Plum Lane, and at the butcher's, the gossip turned sharp. "Too elegant by half," muttered old Mr. Hargraves. "Always thought she looked like she was hiding something behind those pearls." But it was at the vicarage that the day's true revelation began to take shape. Miss Marple arrived just after 11, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. She greeted Reverend Maitland with her usual grace and was promptly ushered into his study, where she laid the parcel on his writing desk. "It's from Josiah's studio," she said simply. The vicar looked puzzled. "What is it?" "A painting," said Miss Marple, "of sorts." Reverend Maitland carefully opened the wrapping. Inside was a stretched canvas, smaller than most of Josiah's work, its frame chipped and dusty. The surface had been scrubbed with something possibly spirits, but faint outlines remained. A pair of hands delicately posed. A sliver of crimson velvet draped across what had once been a shoulder. The upper half had been crudely scraped away, but the posture, the proportions, and the technique were unmistakably Josiah's. "Where? Did you find it?" the vicar asked, breathless. "In the church shed," said Miss Marple, "behind the harvest banners. I believe Rosalind placed it there the night of the Institute meeting. Perhaps she meant to retrieve it later, or destroy it, but something stopped her." "And you believe it's her?" "I do," said Miss Marple. "More importantly, she believes it's her, and that fear of being recognized, of being exposed, tells us more than the painting ever could." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid another visit to Constable Brent, who was poring over handwritten notes at the station. "She was born Rosalind Faulkner," he said without preamble. "Found a match in a 1932 school record from Sussex. Only child. Father was a tradesman, mother deceased. But she disappears from the record in 1949. No marriage certificate, no employment files, nothing. No death certificate either?" Miss Marple asked. "No, but the trail picks up again in 1952. A woman named Rose Dacre appears in a London theater program. Chorus role. Small part." Miss Marple nodded. "A new name, a new life." Brent continued. "She married a minor art dealer. Lived abroad for a while Paris, then Milan. The dealer died in 59. No children. Since then, nothing until she arrived here." "And her husband?" Miss Marple asked. "Bit of a rogue, from what I gather. He dealt in unlicensed works, sold counterfeits on occasion. Died of a fall, officially, but there were whispers." "Which would explain Rosalind's caution," Miss Marple murmured. "If she knew her husband's dealings or helped hide them, perhaps even sat for artists he scammed, knowingly or not." Brent frowned. "You think Josiah knew who she was?" "I think he found out," Miss Marple replied. "Maybe by accident. Maybe through a sketch. Artists notice patterns. Others ignore. A scar, a gesture. a name misremembered. She leaned forward slightly, and when he asked her to sit if he did, perhaps it wasn't flattery, perhaps it was insurance. Brents scribbled furiously. "Do we bring her in?" "No, miss." Marple said calmly, "We wait." That evening, a note arrived at Clarissa's cottage, slipped through the letterbox, unsigned, written in tight slanted script. "Please meet me at Josiah's studio. Midnight. I cannot carry this secret anymore. Miss Marple read it twice, then handed it silently to Clarissa. "Are you going?" "Of course," Miss Marple replied. Secrets don't like to be kept waiting. Midnight arrived with a soft drizzle. Clunberry's cottages were dark, save for the yellow glow of oil lamps flickering behind thick curtains. The wind hummed through the hedgerows as Miss Marple stepped out, her boots careful on the slick path. Josiah's studio stood as silent as a confession box. She reached the door and found it unlocked inside. The air smelled of varnish and mildew. A candle flickered near the desk, and standing beside the empty canvas rack, wrapped in a navy shawl and trembling ever so slightly, was Rosalind Dacre. "I thought it was only fair," she said, without turning, "that you should know." Miss Marple closed the door behind her. "I'm listening." Rosalind faced her. Her expression was hard, defiant, but beneath that veneer was something else, a woman unraveling. "I sat for him," she said. "Once. It was meant to be nothing, a way to test if I could bear to be seen again as I really am. You chose. The velvet. It reminded me of the curtain, backstage years ago. I loved it before it loved me back. When Josiah painted me, I thought it might redeem something. But instead, he recognized you," Miss Marple said. Rosalind's chin lifted. "He said my face matched a sketch he saw once in Paris. Said it was part of a fraud investigation, an unclaimed portrait tied to a stolen collection. My husband's doing, most likely. I had no part in it. But he said he'd speak to the authorities. And you couldn't risk that." Rosalind's voice cracked. "I gave him belladonna, just to make him ill. I didn't mean to kill him. I thought he'd sleep, forget. But he didn't. And the painting? I tried to destroy it, but I couldn't do it. It was the last thing of me that felt ... true." Miss Marple stepped closer. "You're not the first to run from a life, Mrs. Dacre, but you are the first to leave a velvet trail behind you." Rosalind sank into the old studio chair, shoulders hunched. "What will happen now?" "That," Miss Marple said gently, "is for the constable to decide. But I believe in leniency when it comes to tragedy, and I believe you've punished yourself enough already." Outside, the drizzle turned to mist. The village slept on, unaware that one of its mysteries had just been quietly resolved, by morning. Rosalind Dacre had left Clunberry. No fanfare, no goodbye. Just a single envelope, addressed to Miss Marple, left in the vicar's postbox. Inside was a small photograph of the portrait, as it once had been before the smearing, before the scraping dot in it. A woman in red velvet sat in profile, a wistful half-smile on her lips. At the bottom, written in delicate ink, were 5 words. "Thank you for seeing me." Chapter 6. The Man with the Missing Frame. The days that followed Rosalind Dacre's quiet departure were filled with a kind of subdued relief in Clunberry. No one spoke openly of her absence, but her house at the edge of Plum Lane remained shuttered, its windows blank, its garden unwatered, Miss Butterfield had removed her account from the fabric shop ledger with a tight-lipped efficiency, and Mrs. Larch donated the leftover lemon tarts to the church luncheon with no mention of their former patron, Miss Marple, however, had not yet filed the affair away in her mind. Rosalind's confession, real though it was, had settled many questions, but not all. The method, yes. The motive, plausible. But the painting still whispered to her. More specifically, the absence of the painting, because even as the photograph of the ruined portrait sat carefully folded in Miss Marple's sewing box, there remained a persistent rumor circulating the village that someone had seen a large, covered canvas being transported the morning after Josiah Crane was found dead. Not to the church shed, as Miss Marple had assumed, but away from the village entirely. And if that rumor were true, it meant the canvas Miss Marple had found was not the original portrait, but something left in its place. It was Mrs. Digby, with her usual talent for being unintentionally precise, who gave the first useful clue. I was on my way to visit my sister in Barleyham, she said over seed cake at Clarissa's, and I saw Harold Frimley's van rattling down the lane. He never drives out that early, not unless he's delivering to someone important. I waved, but he didn't see me, or ignored me, the rogue. Miss Marple stirred her tea. You're certain it was the morning after the harvest fair? Of course I am, said Mrs. Digby, affronted. I remember because I wore my paisley scarf, the one my sister loathes, and it was still damp from the fair. Clarissa gave Miss Marple a sideways glance. Harold Frimley only delivers furniture, and once, under some suspicion, a grandfather clock he claimed was his uncle's. Mrs. Digby brightened. And picture frames. He collects them from the auctions at Lanford Green. Miss Marple set down her cup. Then it's time I had a word with Mr. Frimley. Harold Frimley lived above his workshop at the bend in Barrow Lane. The sign outside F.A. and Son, Antique Restoration, was peeling and unnecessary, as there had never been a son, and most villagers knew the man by the sound of his van's coughing engine rather than his name. He was a tall man with large hands and a suspicious squint, and he opened the door to Miss Marple with an expression that suggested he'd hoped to avoid conversation for the day. "Good morning, Mr. Frimley," she said cheerfully. "Might I trouble you for a moment?" His expression didn't change, but he stepped aside. The workshop smelled of linseed oil and dust. Frames in various stages of disrepair lined the walls. At the back, an unfinished chair sat beneath a cloth. Miss Marple admired a gilt frame with acanthus leaves before turning politely. "I believe you were seen driving out early the morning after the harvest fair." Frimley shrugged. "Might have been. I had a delivery." "To whom?" "Private client." Miss Marple smiled. "I quite understand. Discretion is important in your line of work, but when the delivery in question may involve stolen property, particularly a painting removed from a deceased man's studio, it becomes rather less private." Frimley paled slightly. "I didn't steal anything." "No," Miss Marple said, "but perhaps you were paid to remove something. Something painted by Josiah Crane." He swallowed. "Look, I didn't ask questions. A man met me just past Windy Hill. Said he had a canvas that needed storing. Paid in cash, said it was old. He was well-dressed, thin, didn't give a name." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And where did you take it?" "I kept it in the storeroom." But, well, it's gone now. Gone? He nodded, almost sheepishly. The man came back 2 nights ago, took it himself, let himself in with a spare key from the flower pot. Didn't leave a note. Describe him. Firmly squinted, tall city accent. Gray hair slicked back, fancy shoes. Looked like someone who used to have money. Miss Marple's heart gave a quiet lurch. She had heard that description before. She thanked Mr. Frimley and stepped out into the wind, drawing her coat tighter Dot if her instinct was correct. The painting hadn't been taken by a stranger at all, Dot. It had been claimed by someone with a stronger motive than Rosalind Dacre. Someone who might not be finished. That evening, Clarissa frowned as Miss Marple explained what she'd learned. But I thought Rosalind admitted to everything, she said. The belladonna, the velvet, the painting. She admitted to trying to stop Josiah, Miss Marple said softly. But she didn't kill him. The amount of belladonna found in his system was not fatal, certainly not enough to cause death by heart failure. Someone else must have seen an opportunity and taken it. Clarissa blinked. You mean a second visitor? Miss Marple nodded. A man with a link to both Josiah and Rosalind. A man who knew what that painting showed and who understood the value of silence. She stood slowly and moved to the mantel, where the folded photograph of the original portrait now rested in an envelope. She thought Josiah might report her, but someone else knew better. They knew what Josiah had discovered. That painting, that was the threat. Clarissa's eyes widened. You think he was blackmailing someone? No, Miss Marple murmured. I think he was about to. The next morning brought a quiet knock at Clarissa's door. Dot. It was Constable Brent, face drawn, holding a telegram. From the Metropolitan Police, he said. I asked for a background check on Rosalind's late husband. Look here, one of his known associates, Lionel Harcourt, art broker, expelled from the trade in '58, suspected of selling counterfeit works, disappeared for a few years, resurfaced recently under a new name. Miss Marple took the slip and read it. Lionel Harcourt, now known as Leonard Harrow, resident of Bramble House, Clunbury. Clarissa's mouth fell open. But Leonard Harrow runs the antiques appraisal stall at the Summer Fete. Miss Marple gave a small, grim nod. Indeed. And I believe it was he, not Rosalind, who visited Josiah the night before the fair, and who returned for the portrait before anyone could find it. Brett looked shaken. Do we arrest him? Miss Marple shook her head. No, we invite him for tea. She looked out the window, where the clouds were thinning into pale ribbons, and while he sips from a cup, we'll show him the photograph. She smiled faintly. People always look at themselves differently when painted by someone else. Chapter 7. Tea with a gentleman of taste it was. Just past 3 o'clock the next day, when Leonard Harrow arrived at Clarissa's cottage for tea. He was dressed, as always, with understated elegance, navy suit, camel scarf, gold cufflinks. His shoes were polished to a reflective gleam, and he carried himself with a studied grace that seemed to suggest he had long practiced the art of being unmemorable in the right circles, which Miss Marple reflected as she poured the tea was often the mark of a man who'd spent time outrunning something. Miss Marple, he said smoothly as he accepted his cup. Such a pleasure to be invited. And Clarissa, you're looking well. Clarissa offered a stiff smile. We thought you might appreciate a little quiet conversation. Clonbury's been rather lively of late." "Indeed," said Harold, stirring his tea. "The tragic passing of Mr. Crane, wasn't it? So sad. I heard he was quite gifted." Miss Marple nodded. "Oh, yes, especially in portraits. He had a remarkable eye for character, and more importantly, for detail." Harrow's smile didn't falter. "So I understand. Though I confess I never sat for him." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "No, I imagine you wouldn't have liked that. An artist who sees past the frame might recognize what others don't." Clarissa, seated beside her friend, passed around the shortbread in silence. Miss Marple leaned forward, just slightly. "You know, I've been thinking about frames. Quite a lot. You used to in art dealing, didn't you, Mr. Harrow?" The man's cup paused mid-er. "Yes, many years ago. London, mostly. Small galleries." "Interesting field," said Miss Marple. "So many transactions and so many reputations to maintain. Must be terribly difficult when one finds oneself entangled in a fraud, even inadvertently." Harrow's smile finally dipped at the edges. "I assure you, Miss Marple, I've always conducted myself professionally." "I'm sure," said Miss Marple gently, "though it must have been unpleasant to be associated with Lionel Harcourt." He froze. Clarissa looked down quickly at her plate, pretending not to listen. Leonard Harrow set down his cup with deliberate care. "I don't know that name." "No?" Miss Marple asked innocently. "That's very odd." "Because I have it on reliable authority that Lionel Harcourt was once your business partner, a rather ambitious man, and that he vanished after a number of stolen works were traced to his firm." "I really—" Miss Marple opened a small envelope and slid a photograph across the table. "Perhaps this will jog your memory." He stared down at the image, a faint aged photo of Josiah Crane's portrait, the version before it had been ruined. The red velvet, the delicate hands, and there unmistakably in the background, a male figure not quite fully rendered, but visible enough to be recognized. Leonard Harrow. His eyes narrowed. "She gave you that?" "No," said Miss Marple. "Rosalind didn't know it still existed. But Josiah was careful. He took a photograph before he ever lifted a brush." Silence stretched between them. Then Harrow leaned back with a bitter smile. "Well then, I suppose this is the part where you call your constable." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, not yet." Clarissa blinked. "Jane, he hasn't confessed," Miss Marple said calmly. "He's only remembered." Harrow's voice was tight. "You think I killed him?" "I know you were there," Miss Marple said. "That you went to Josiah Crane with the hope of buying back that painting, or destroying it, because it showed what you never wanted revealed, that you were still alive and in hiding, and that Rosalind, your former associate's widow, was now within reach." "She thought I was dead," Harrow murmured. "She would have told them everything if she knew I was alive. She had nothing to lose. I had everything. And Josiah?" Clarissa asked. Harrow didn't answer at first. He stared at the fire. Then I offered him money. He refused. He said he was tired of painting chickens, that he wanted to do something true, that people deserved to know what he saw. And when money didn't work, Miss Marple asked softly, I told him I'd ruin him. He laughed. Said he wasn't afraid of people like me anymore. "So you slipped him something," she said. while he was drinking tea or cider, something more potent than belladonna. Harrow's voice dropped, only a drop, enough to stop his heart if it was already weak, enough to silence him quietly. No marks, no mess? He looked up, and for the first time, the weariness behind his eyes cracked through the polish. I didn't want to kill him, he whispered. I just couldn't let him finish the painting. I'd buried that life for years. She left it behind, too. She tried, said Miss Marple, but the past has a habit of waiting, patiently. There was a long, heavy silence. Then Harrow stood. I'll leave now, he said. I know what comes next. But Miss Marple shook her head. You'll stay, he blinked. You're not turning me in? Not yet. The police will come for you soon enough. But first, you'll write a statement. You'll tell them everything, how you changed your name, what you did, who you threatened, and why Josiah Crane had to die. He stared at her. Why? Would one? Because, said Miss Marple, rising slowly, it's the last painting you'll ever be in, and it's time you signed your name. That evening, Constable Brent arrived at Clarissa's with a warrant in hand. Leonard Harrow went quietly, his confession in a sealed envelope. He said nothing more, but as he passed Miss Marple at the doorway, he gave the faintest of nods less in gratitude than resignation. Miss Marple watched him disappear into the mist. Clarissa brought her a shawl and asked softly, Do you think justice will be done? Miss Marple, gazing toward the silent green, replied, In a village, justice never comes all at once. It arrives in glances, in whispers, in truths that finally rise to the surface. And with that, she returned to her knitting. Chapter 8. The last sketch in the book. The week that followed Leonard Harrow's arrest was unusually quiet in Clonberry. The leaves turned a crisp ochre, and the air carried the first scents of chimney, smoke, and damp soil. At the bakery, the talk shifted back to scones and rising yeast. At the draper's, velvet was once again just velvet. Miss Marple, however, remained inwardly restless. Leonard Harrow had confessed, yes, but something still sat uneasily in her mind. Not the motive, nor even the method, which she accepted with grim clarity. It was a detail, something small and faintly out of place, like a brushstroke layered too thick in a watercolor. Something that had not yet revealed its weight. She returned once more to Josiah Crane's cottage. The constable on duty let her in without objection. The studio had been dusted and boxed, sketches catalogued, papers logged. But one item remained untouched. Josiah's leather-bound sketchbook, found beneath a loose board in the floor, just behind the easel. A hiding spot, Miss Marple thought, chosen with care, as if the artist knew that what he drew might one day require protection. She lifted the sketchbook carefully and sat at the desk, the light from the window falling softly over the pages. The early sketches were unremarkable barns, livestock, familiar village faces rendered in charcoal. But as she turned each page, a transformation became apparent. The lines grew bolder. The composition's more personal faces began to reappear. Rosalind Dagger in profile. The red velvet draped over her shoulder. And on the next page, a double portrait. Rosalind again standing with her back turned, and another figure blurred, half-formed, as though Josiah had struggled to capture him. A man in shadow, his posture stiff, his jaw clenched. But it was the final page that made her pause. It was a simple sketch, unfinished and smaller than the others. It showed not a person, but a room. Josiah's studio. The walls, the window, the easel in place. But there, in the corner of the drawing, was an object that hadn't appeared in any other rendering. A small, ornately carved wooden box, marked with a single flourish, a letter C. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She had seen no such box in the studio, nor had it been catalogued with the other effects. And yet Josiah had drawn it, purposefully and with detailed. She rose from the desk and crossed to the corner. Josiah had depicted behind the cabinet of paints and past the rack of brushes. She ran her fingers along the floorboards until one shifted. False panel. Inside it, the box. She lifted it free. It was heavy, with a brass latch and a faint scent of varnish. She opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them neatly folded and tied with string. Miss Marple withdrew one and opened it carefully. My dearest R., you must understand, if I give Josiah the portrait, it is not to harm you, but to finally be seen. I can no longer live behind another man's name while pretending I am not buried. Alive. I never expected you here. I never expected to feel anything again. But now that I do, I must choose the truth. Oh, Miss Marple sat very still. The letter was in Leonard Harrow's hand, and it was not dated before Josiah's death, but the day before the harvest fair. She read another, and another. With each, the shape of the tragedy shifted in her mind. These were not the letters of a killer planning a cover-up. They were the writings of a man on the edge of confession, a man ready to surrender the painting to Josiah, not destroy it. A man torn, yes, but remorseful. So if Harrow hadn't returned to the studio with poison in his hand, then who had? She looked again at the initials on the box. C. Clarissa. No, Miss Marple dismissed that thought immediately. Her old friend's faults did not include homicide. Then she saw a torn note stuck to the underside of the lid. Almost missed, she peeled it back. It was written in smaller, more angular script. A different hand entirely. The portrait is a liability. It must be removed. Josiah cannot be allowed to keep talking. He doesn't understand what's at stake. I'll collect it myself if you won't. Midnight, no more hesitation. No signature. Miss Marple didn't need one. There was only one other person who had known about the portrait, who had access to the studio, who had slipped quietly through. The narrative like a background figure in a crowd scene. Someone who'd gone unnoticed, precisely because they'd wanted to be. She closed the box, tucked it under her arm, and walked briskly out of the cottage. It was time to pay a final visit. That evening, Miss Marple sat with Clarissa near the fire, tea cooling in their cups. I found the box, she said quietly. Behind the false floor, Josiah hid it well. Clarissa turned from the flames. The sketchbook? Still there, and a note. Not from Harrow, from someone else. Someone who knew how dangerous Josiah's painting really was. Clarissa frowned. Then Harrow didn't know. He may have returned to reclaim the painting, but someone else got there first. Miss Marple met her friend's eyes. It was Gilda Martin. Clarissa gasped. The dressmaker? Yes, and Rosalind's old companion, once. She followed her here, quietly, took a cottage under her maiden name. She worked with Harrow in Paris briefly, a minor forger used for copying embroidery patterns. She knew what Harrow was hiding, and she knew that if the painting surfaced, everything would unravel. But why kill Josiah? Because he wasn't bluffing, Miss Marple said. He planned to exhibit the portrait. She panicked. She visited Teth's studio. Had been dusted and boxed, sketches catalogued, papers logged. But one item remained untouched. Josiah's leather-bound sketchbook, found beneath a loose board in the floor, just behind the easel. A hiding spot, Miss Marple thought, chosen with care, as if the artist knew that what he drew might one day require protection. She lifted the sketchbook carefully and sat at the desk, the light from the window falling softly over the pages. The early sketches were unremarkable: barns, livestock, familiar village faces rendered in charcoal. But as she turned each page, a transformation became apparent. The lines grew bolder. The composition's more personal, dark faces began to reappear. Rosalind Dacre in profile, the red velvet draped over her shoulder dot, and on the next page, a double portrait. Rosalind again, standing with her back turned, and another figure blurred, half-formed as though Josiah had struggled to capture him. A man in shadow, his posture stiff, his jaw clenched. But it was the final page that made her pause. Dot. It was a simple sketch, unfinished and smaller than the others. It showed not a person, but a room. Josiah's studio. Dot. The walls, the window, the easel in place. But there, in the corner of the drawing, was an object that hadn't appeared in any other rendering. A small, ornately carved wooden box, marked with a single flourish a letter C. Dot. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She had seen no such box in the studio, nor had it been catalogued with the other effects. And yet Josiah had drawn it purposefully and with detailed dot. She rose from the desk and crossed to the corner. Josiah had depicted behind the cabinet of paints and past the rack of brushes. She ran her fingers along the floorboards until one shifted. A false panel dot inside it. The box. She lifted it free. It was heavy, with a brass latch and a faint scent of varnish. She opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, neatly folded and tied with string. Miss Marple withdrew one and opened it carefully. Dot. My dearest R. You must understand, if I give Josiah the portrait, it is not to harm you, but to finally be seen. I can no longer live behind another man's name while pretending I am not buried. Alive, I never expected you here. I never expected to feel anything again. But now that I do, I must choose the truth. Miss Marple sat very still. The letter was in Leonard Harrow's hand, and it was not dated before Josiah's death, but the day before the harvest fair. She read another, and another. With each, the shape of the tragedy shifted in her mind. These were not the letters of a killer planning a cover-up. They were the writings of a man on the edge of confession, a man ready to surrender the painting to Josiah, not destroy it. A man torn, yes, but remorseful. Dot. So if Harrow hadn't returned to the studio with poison in his hand, then who had? She looked again at the initials on the box. C. Clarissa. No, Miss Marple dismissed that thought immediately. Her old friend's faults did not include homicide. Then she saw a torn note stuck to the underside of the lid. Almost missed. She peeled it back. It was written in smaller, more angular script. A different hand entirely. The portrait is a liability. It must be removed. Josiah cannot be allowed to keep talking. He doesn't understand what's at stake. I'll collect it myself if you won't. Midnight. No more hesitation. No signature. Miss Marple didn't need one. There was only one other person who had known about the portrait, who had access to the studio, who had slipped quietly through. The narrative like a background figure in a crowd scene. Someone who'd gone unnoticed precisely because they'd wanted to be. She closed the box, tucked it under her arm, and walked briskly out of the cottage. It was time to pay a final visit. That evening, Miss Marple sat with Clarissa near the fire, tea cooling in their cups. "I found the box," she said quietly. Behind the false floor, Josiah hid it well. Clarissa turned from the flames. The sketchbook? Still there, and a note. Not from Harrow, from someone else. Someone who knew how dangerous Josiah's painting really was. Clarissa frowned. Then Harrow didn't. No, he may have returned to reclaim the painting. But someone else got there first. Miss Marple met her friend's eyes. It was Gilda Martin. Clarissa gasped. The dressmaker? Yes, and Rosalind's old companion, once. She followed her here, quietly. Took a cottage under her maiden name. She worked with Harrow in Paris briefly. A minor forger used for copying embroidery patterns. She knew what Harrow was hiding, and she knew that if the painting surfaced, everything would unravel. But why kill Josiah? Because he wasn't bluffing, Miss Marple said. He planned to exhibit the portrait. She panicked. She visited the studio the morning of the fair, brought him her thanks and a cordial. He trusted her. She stayed to see it take effect, and when his breathing changed, she walked out, calm as ever. Clarissa stared at the fire. So many masks in such a small village. Yes, Miss Marple said softly, but Josiah saw past them. That was his gift. He painted what people really were. Clarissa touched her friend's hand. And you, Jane? Miss Marple smiled. Faintly. I only notice when they flinch. Chapter 9. The seamstress behind the curtain. The morning mist lingered over Clunbury, like a curtain unwilling to rise. Beneath the veil of drizzle, the village seemed hushed, as though even the bricks and branches were listening. Somewhere a church bell chimed 9 soft. Solitary Dot, Miss Marple, walked with quiet purpose, her sensible shoes tapping against the damp cobblestones. The weight of the previous day's discovery still rested on her mind, not heavy, but certain. There was no longer any doubt in her thoughts, only the last unraveling of thread. Dot. She turned down the narrow path, past the mill pond, and stopped at a modest dwelling at the edge of the tree's Rosewick cottage. From the outside, it was everything a country home ought to be. Whitewashed walls, lace curtains, a well-trimmed hedge. But something was missing. Charm. There were no flower pots by the door, no personal touches, no faded children's boots half forgotten on the step. The house bore the exacting neatness of a stage set. A backdrop, Miss Marple thought. Not a home. She knocked. Once. Twice. The door creaked open. Standing before her was Gilda Martin. She wore a forest green cardigan over a pale blouse, buttoned tightly at the throat. Her dark hair was wound into a bun so firm it looked carved. There was no hint of welcome on her face, but neither was there surprise. Miss Marple, she said, I rather thought you'd come. You always were rather good at anticipation, Miss Marple replied. May I? A pause. Then Gilda stepped aside. Of course. The sitting room was tidy and spare. A sewing machine stood by the window. A bolt of plum-colored cloth lay across a table, uncut. On a small shelf were 5 books manuals on dressmaking and one old copy of French criminal trials, its spine broken. The room smelled faintly of rose soap and lavender polish. Tea? Gilda offered. "No, thank you," said Miss Marple, settling into a firm-backed chair. "I won't stay long." Gilda folded her hands in front of her, fingers interlaced. Her knuckles were pale, her wrists narrow. "Then let's not waste time." Miss Marple studied her face. There was no panic there, only calm resistance. Look, she thought of someone who had rehearsed this conversation alone. "Many times you were in Josiah Crane's studio the morning he died," Miss Marple began. "I've never denied that." "No, but you never mentioned it either." "I had nothing useful to say." Miss Marple gave a soft breath of amusement. "Gilda, dear, you were a companion to Rosalind Dacre for 4 years. You knew her husband's real identity. You worked under Harold, perhaps even forged on his behalf. You followed her here to Clenbury under your maiden name, and then, coincidentally, the only man who recognized both you and Harold turned up dead." Gilda didn't flinch. "Coincidences happen." "They do," said Miss Marple, "but not 3 in the same week." Silence stretched between them. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew the small wooden box, the one she had found in Josiah's hidden floorboard. She opened it and turned it toward Gilda. "These are your letters." Gilda's eyes flicked down briefly. Her voice remained even. "No, they were to me, not from me." "True, but that hardly matters now." She withdrew the final note, the one written in narrow, urgent hand. "The portrait is a liability. It must be removed. Josiah cannot be allowed to keep talking. He doesn't understand what's at stake. I'll collect it myself if you won't. Midnight." No more hesitation. Miss Marple laid it on the table. Gilda's gaze rested on it. "I didn't mean to kill him." "You brought the cordial," said Miss Marple. "It had belladonna and something else, perhaps digitalis." Josiah was already weakened from exhaustion, from stress. He was a man of gentle habits. He trusted you. Gilda's jaw tightened. "I needed the portrait. To destroy it? No, to keep it." Her voice sharpened, finally cracking. "Don't you understand? That painting was the last truth about Leonard, about who he was, what he did, and how much he hated it." Miss Marple sat back slightly. "So you loved him?" Gilda blinked. "Don't be absurd. You followed him from Paris to London, hid his past, protected Rosalind when she ran, kept Sile, while he changed names. That sort of service rarely comes without sentiment." "I wasn't in love," said Gilda, her voice low. "I believed in redemption." Miss Marple waited. Gilda exhaled slowly. "I told him it was dangerous to paint her, that the red velvet would be noticed, that people like you would notice. But he didn't listen. He said Rosalind deserved to be seen as she was, not a widow, not a secret, just a person. I asked him to destroy it. He wouldn't, so you went there. I only meant to frighten him. I threatened to expose him, to tell Rosalind what Leonard was planning. She thought him dead. She built a new life. It would ruin her. And the cordial? He said he had a headache. I had it in my bag for myself. I thought it might calm him, just a little. I added it to his tea while he fetched his coat. Miss Marple tilted her head, and then Gilda's voice faltered. He drank it. He said he felt dizzy. Then he smiled as if he'd accepted something, and he sat down. Said he needed to rest. I left. I told myself he'd sleep it off, but he never woke. No, said Gilda. He didn't. The rain tapped lightly against the window panes. You went back, didn't you? Miss Marple asked gently. Later that night, Gilda nodded. I took the portrait. I buried it, wrapped it in oilcloth, and laid it behind the old stone wall near the vicarage field. No one ever goes there. Why not burn it? Because, Gilda whispered, it was beautiful. Miss Marple stood. You'll tell Constable Brent everything, of course. Gilda rose too. He'll arrest me. He might. But he'll... Listen, Josiah's death was not premeditated, and you didn't act for greed. You acted out of fear, and perhaps love. Gilda's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Love is a dangerous word. In Clunbury, Miss Marple said, moving toward the door, so is silence. 2 days later, Miss Marple watched as the portrait was gently laid on an easel in the village hall, the room specially cleared for the coroner's inquest. A single cloth covered the canvas. The police had recovered it precisely where Gilda said that only Miss Marple had been permitted to see the image first, that it was, as Gilda had claimed, beautiful. Rosalind stood in profile, hair loose, expression thoughtful, not mournful, draped in the red velvet. Behind her only shadow. The suggestion of a man watching her barely sketched an outline, a presence. Josiah Crane had captured something more than appearance. He had captured choice, the choice to be seen, the choice to be known, even if it cost him everything. When the villagers were invited to view it, they stood in reverent silence that Miss Marple sat quietly at the back. Clarissa leaned toward her. Do you think the truth will stay hidden? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They only need to be painted, and someone already did. Clarissa exhaled. Do you think Gilda will go to prison? I think she may, Miss Marple said, but I also think she'll finally sleep. That evening, as the rain returned and the village settled into its hush, Miss Marple took her knitting and sat by the fire. Clarissa brought the tea and asked, Will you start another scarf? No, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. I think I'll mend something instead. There's always something with a loose thread. It just takes a moment to notice it. She reached for her basket, pulled a soft red swatch from beneath the wool, and threaded her needle dot chapter 10. The portrait in the light by the following Thursday, the air in Clunbury had turned unmistakably wintry. The hedgerows shimmered with early frost, and children on their way to school could be heard crunching across frozen puddles with the joyous certainty of seasonal change. In the Rose and Crown, Mrs. Pemble was back to serving steaming mugs of cider, and the gossip had gently shifted from poisonings and painters to the more palatable scandal of young Daisy, Hargrove's engagement to the greengrocer's son. But the stillness that returned to Clunbury was only surface deep. The village remembered as villages always do, even when it pretended not to, and in the shadows of its quiet corners lingered the echoes of one man's death, a handful of unspoken names, and a painting that now hung locked away in the constable's office awaiting the coroner's final word. Miss Marple, however, had not yet returned to St. Mary Mead. She had delayed her departure by several days, and, much to Clarissa's surprise, requested only light company, simple food, and the indulgence of one final walk through the village before she left. It was during that walk, beneath the skeletal oaks lining the lane to Josiah Crane's now abandoned studio, that Clarissa finally asked the question that had gnawed at her since the night of Gilda's confession. "You knew it wasn't Harrow from the start, didn't you?" Miss Marple gave a faint, almost apologetic smile. "I suspected," she said. "But in matters of guilt, dear Clarissa, suspicion and proof are as different as a knotted thread and a clean stitch. You must tug gently, else everything unravels too fast." Clarissa frowned. "But Harrow confessed? He turned himself in?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but a confession is only as useful as the motive behind it. And Harrow's motive was not guilt for a murder. It was shame. Shame for the man he had been, and fear that someone Josiah Crane might unmask him publicly. That sort of shame, my dear, leads men to many foolish things, including false guilt." Clarissa looked out toward the orchard. "So you believe he meant to surrender the painting?" "Oh, I don't believe it," Miss Marple said. "I know it. He wrote it plainly enough in his letter to Gilda. The real question was why Gilda went to the studio when she did, and that answer, too, was simple though unpleasant." Clarissa waited. She was trying to preserve a version of the past that could no longer survive in the light. Miss Marple stopped, gazing at the studio's shuttered windows. Gilda Martin wasn't just hiding Harrow's crimes. She was hiding herself. Her life had been constructed entirely in relation to others, Rosalind, Harrow, even Josiah. When he threatened to reveal a truth she'd helped bury, she didn't kill him out of malice. She killed him because she didn't know how else to exist. Clarissa drew her coat tighter, and yet she buried the portrait. "She did," Miss Marple said, "and in that she did something rather human. She couldn't destroy it, because Josiah had seen something in her, just as he had in Rosalind. Not guilt, but dignity. A last chance to be known as she truly was." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind gently stirring the ivy. Clinging to the studio wall, then Clarissa asked, almost shyly, "And the smock?" Miss Marple chuckled. "Ah, yes, the clue in the pocket. It had been, at first glance, a simple thing, one of Josiah's many painting smocks, folded on the chair in the corner of the studio. Constable Brent had overlooked it during his first sweep, believing it to be another paint-stained relic. But Miss Marple, with her eye for domestic detail, had noticed something peculiar. It was clean, too clean, as if someone had washed and replaced it recently. She had asked Clarissa to bring it to her dot, and there, in the front pocket, carefully tucked in the seam, was a single object, a button wooden, hand-carved with a flourish of leaves etched into. Its surface dot, Miss Marple had seen buttons like that before. They were not mass-produced. They were custom dot, and Gilda Martin had been known to make them herself. That button, silent and overlooked, had tied her to the studio on the day of the murder, not just as a visitor, but as someone who had been close enough to leave part of her. Craft behind Miss Marple had said nothing at the time. She had waited. Gilda had confessed long before the button was ever mentioned, but it had been, in Miss Marple's words, a comforting bit of thread to hold on to. The coroner's inquest, held in the village hall 2 days later, was brief but thorough. The official verdict: death by poisoning, administered through ingestion of a sedative compound, likely containing belladonna and foxglove extract. The deceased had been in a weakened state. The toxicology report confirmed both substances. The jury returned with a formal finding: death by misadventure with circumstantial implication of a third party. Gilda Martin, under legal advice and with quiet dignity, pled guilty to manslaughter. Her sentence was suspended owing to cooperation, lack of prior offense, and the absence of clear intent to kill. She would serve no time, but was asked to leave Clenbury within the week. She complied. No one saw her go. The portrait, after some debate, was given to Clarissa to store in the Historical Society archives. It was never displayed publicly, but it was preserved with Josiah's name carved into a brass plate beneath the frame. Clarissa kept it in a locked room, and every year on the date of his death she would sit before it and leave a single white carnation. Only once did she take a visitor inside. It was Miss Marple, and even then she said only he saw people as they were, not as they pretended to be, to which Miss Marple replied, the rarest gift. As she packed her bags on the final morning of her visit, Miss Marple tucked the smock button into a small wooden case she carried with her, a keepsake box filled with items that, to anyone else, would seem quite meaningless: a knitting needle cap, a dried sprig of lavender, a silver thimble with a dent in the side. But to Miss Marple, each was a story, a lesson, a memory. She added the button beside them with quiet care. When Clarissa came to see her off, she found Miss Marple already at the door, hat and gloves perfectly aligned. "You'll come again?" Clarissa said, trying not to sound too pleading. Miss Marple smiled. "I always seem to return to places with unfinished stitching." They embraced briefly. As the taxi pulled away from the garden gate, Clarissa watched until it vanished around the bend. She turned slowly back to the cottage, and she noticed something she hadn't before. On the arm of Miss Marple's chair, where she had last been knitting, sat a single line of red yarn, a quiet reminder of truth. Of patience, of a woman who watched the world with kindness and remembered everything it tried to forget. In the quiet of the taxi, Miss Marple let the landscape roll past her: hedgerows, sheep-dotted fields, a steeple in the distance. She reflected, as she often did, not on the murderer, but on the village, on how tightly people wove their secrets into ordinary lives, and how easily beauty and shame coexisted side by side. The world, she thought, was neither cruel nor kind. It was simply made up of people, which, in its way, was more dangerous and more marvelous